Okay, good to see you tonight. Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you taking time to be a part of this effort as we continue our study from the Proverbs. I think that this study of wisdom and the study of the Proverbs is vitally important. Sometimes it may seem to people that, well, these things are so basic, and they are in many ways. We can't help but think about the old saying that the problem with common sense is it's not common enough. It's not that we're shocked and amazed by the conclusions of the Proverbs as much as we are reminded about things that we know we ought to do, but we don't do, or we forget in the moment. There's a great quotation, one of my favorite quotations from I believe a very underrated president, Calvin Coolidge, who was in office about 100 years ago. A fellow that was full of common sense, it seems to me. And he's quoted as saying, "They criticize me for harping on the obvious. If all the folks in the United States would do the few simple things they know they ought to do, most of our big problems would take care of themselves." You know, that's a great point. And I think it's just as true today in a spiritual connotation as it was then. Our problem so many times is just that we act emotionally, or we get caught up in the moment, or we're too influenced by the world. So no, the Proverbs, maybe they're just reminders. Maybe they're not things for the most part that we've never thought about before, but they are essential things that if we can shape our thinking around them and our actions and reactions around them, we'll be a blessing to the world, and we will stay out of a lot of self-made trouble. So that's why I need this study, and why the Lord gave us, I think, the blessing of the book of Proverbs. And tonight we are in chapter 26 and in verse 17. And in this passage we find these words, "He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears." This passage, this proverb, that's the old King James translation, may be translated differently in different translations, a little bit differently. For example, the ESV puts the wandering part on the dog, as well as the man interfering in the quarrel. "Whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears." It's a humorous picture, really, when you think about a fellow who would have the audacity, the lack of judgment, just to see a strange dog wandering by and run up on him and start jerking on his ears, and then be shocked if that doesn't work out very well. The old contemporary English translation or version reads, "It's better to take hold of a mad dog by the ears than to do what? Than to take part in someone else's argument." One more, I think the Bible in Basic English, another paraphrase reads, "He who gets mixed up in a fight which is not his business is like one who takes a dog by the ears while it's still going by." You see the picture. It's ridiculous. A fellow who has so little judgment that he would go over and jerk on the ears of a strange dog. And yet that same illogic and the same kind of foolishness is seen by the Lord in a person who, as this translation suggests, gets mixed up in a fight that is not his business. Everything is not my business. I don't have to have an opinion about everything. I don't know enough to have an opinion about everything. And yet there's just a spirit in some people. They might be in a public place. They're straining to hear what two people over here are talking about, so that they might perhaps at least decide for themselves what they ought to do. And if they're not careful, they go over and give their verdict on the matter. They just don't have that sense that wisdom teaches, to say that this is not my place, that I don't know enough. And what I would say or what I would think about it would not only be unformed, but certainly unwelcome and do no little damage, as the case might be. One more I did put on here on the charts. To step up between two people arguing is as foolish as going out into the street and grabbing a stray dog by the ear. The point is made. The idea is, here is someone who lacks that restraint. We might have enough sense to know we ought not to mess with a stray dog in that way, that we're just going to provoke problems. But we may not have that sense when it deals with dealing with our neighbors or our friends or even strangers, that we would feel the necessity, the freedom to give our opinion about things we know nothing about and that, frankly, we're not involved in. Matthew Henry years ago made this point. If we can be instrumental to make peace between those that are at variance, we must do it. And that's right. And I hope we understand that the wise man is certainly not suggesting that if there is some crisis or tragedy going on, if we were aware that a child was being abused, that we would just sit back and say, well, that's not my problem. That's not what he's talking about, obviously. There are times when morality demands that action be taken. If we saw someone being abused, we would do our best to stop that. So that's not what he's suggesting here. There may be a time when we might be able to be helpful to someone else. We recognize that. Certainly, wisdom recognizes that. Now, continue with Henry. He said, but to make ourselves busy in other men's matters and parties in other men's quarrels is not only to court our own trouble, but to thrust ourselves into temptation. Who made me a judge? That's a great question. And you may remember where that comes from. There's an interesting story over in Luke chapter 12. And I think that this is instructive in more than one way. The story here in Luke 12 is a story about Jesus teaching and then being interrupted, you remember. And without trying to teach all of the great lesson the Lord taught, we'll just go back and look at verse 9, if we may. We're just dropping into the middle, I guess, of the Lord's teaching here. But in Luke 12 and verse 9, but he that denieth me before men shall be denied before the angels of God. And whosoever shall speak a word against the Son of Man, it shall be forgiven him. But unto him that blasphemeth against the Holy Ghost, it shall not be forgiven. These are pretty serious teachings. These are pretty somber lessons that the Lord is engaging the mind of his students in, or trying to. When they bring you, he says, unto the synagogues, unto the magistrates and the powers, take no thought how or what thing ye shall answer, or what ye shall say, for the Holy Ghost shall teach you in the same hour what ye ought to say. So the Lord is making some promises to his disciples. I think he's talking widely on other accounts to the crowd there, talking about things eternal, talking about life and death. And in the middle of that, it seems, in the middle of that, one of the company has obviously not heard a word he's been talking about, not interested. He's got another problem that he just thinks surpasses everything else. Verse 13 reads, one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother, that he divide the inheritance with me. If I understand what's going on here, you have the picture of maybe a death. The man has been, one of the brothers has been appointed an executor of the will. That's a job, tough responsibility. But here's a fellow, another brother, another one of the family, who doesn't think he's getting his fair share. And so he thinks the Lord ought to go over there and tell my brother that I need to get more than I'm getting. He's not doing me right. Lord, you go tell him about this situation. Now, what comes next is really interesting. Jesus said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? And then he said to them, verse 15, Take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesses. And then he told that great, unforgettable parable about the rich man who really was a poor man in terms of the riches that count. He was going to just tear down his barns and build greater. He had it all made. And the Lord said, this is your last day. And now what do you have? All your riches are going to be going to somebody else. And you're without anything. You're a pauper now. Now what? Well, unforgettable lesson. Going back to our guy here, the fellow that piped up in the middle of the Lord's lesson to ask him to fix this problem with the inheritance. Maybe the solution to his problem was given in verse 15. Take heed and beware of covetousness. You are way too tied to things. And if you want me to help you, there's your help. But what I find fascinating is verse 14, when the Lord said, who made me a judge or a diviner over you? Well, I mean, the Lord knew everything. And but the point I think the Lord was making was, that's not why I came. To fix everybody's inheritance problems or to deal with situations like that. I'm here to try to talk to you about things eternal. And it doesn't mean that he doesn't care about the day-to-day. It just simply means that what it teaches us, I believe, is every problem is not our problem. And there are times when it's just not my business. And there are times when, as far as I'm concerned, I may not know enough to be able to help somebody else. And to interfere in such matters would cause more harm than good. There are a lot of examples along that line in the Bible. I can't think of a better one than those words the Lord gave. You know, who made me a judge and a ruler over you? I did not come to fix that problem. I came to help you with things a whole lot more important than that. There's another story, though, that comes to mind, and I guess this, over in 2 Chronicles 35, the setting here has to do with the last of the great kings. There weren't many, but the last of the great kings of Judah, Josiah. And this involves his decision and then the nation as a whole being involved. But after all the good things that he had done, 2 Chronicles 35 and verse 20, you remember, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. And what's going on here, you remember, is that Egypt is warring against Syria. And it was not the will of Josiah, you know, that the Egyptians do that. So he interfered in the matter. He put himself forward in that. He was going to fight with this Necho. It's not his fight. And in fact, it's ironic that here is this man who should have been so close to God and was in many ways. But the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, in verse 21 says, he sent ambassadors to him saying, what have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I come not against thee this day, but against the house whereof I have made war. God has commanded me to make haste. Forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. Well, I don't know what God had told him, but I do know that as the story went on, Josiah wound up losing his life. It was a great tragedy. And really, Judah never recovered from it. You know, sometimes you can tell how serious a matter is by who's crying. And we read about Jeremiah crying over the death of the great prophet, over the death of this king, in a battle he never should have been involved with, meddling in a matter that was not his. I think there's a lesson there that we can learn from. Not every fight is our fight. Not every question is ours to answer. We may not know the answer, or it just may not be our place to give an answer. We've all heard that old saying about fools rush in where angels fear to tread. That's not in the Bible, but we've heard that. I think it's based on this proverb and this truth. The wise man, again, is not advising cowardice. And he's not suggesting that we rein our horns in because we don't want to ever get into trouble. You're going to get into trouble if you serve God sometimes. You're going to have to speak because the truth is at stake. Sometimes morally, sometimes legally, sometimes both. Interference is demanded. We grant all of that. But not as often, not every time. Maybe not as often as I think I like what Mr. Phillips said, and I'll just leave it with this. And I think this is a good summary of this particular point of wisdom. He says, do not act out of an elevated sense of self-importance. That really is what he's attacking here. You know, we think that we can just do what we will and it'll all work out. You wouldn't do that with a stray dog. You'd have more sense than that. You need to have more sense, he says, when you're dealing with other people and their problems. Be realistic about what you can do and what you should do in reference to trying to solve the world. Okay. Let me look at another one with you, if we may. This is from the 26th chapter, this time verse 18. As a madman who casteth firebrands and arrows and death, so is the man that deceiveth his neighbor and saith, am not I in sport? The old King James, I think, still makes that plain. Here's a man who's insane, or he acts insane, acts like a maniac. And so we have a maniac here who's casting arrows. We know what those are. Firebrands. What is a firebrand? I'm told this word suggests an arrow, but maybe more what we think of from the movies, a flaming arrow. Those were sometimes used in war, even in ancient times. And so here's a maniac with a bow and arrow, just shooting arrows and flaming arrows and bringing death on anybody around him. He said that fella is parallel to a man that deceives his neighbor. And then when he gets caught in it, he says, oh, I was just joking. I think the contemporary English version renders that, cheats someone and says, I was only fooling. Or deceives his neighbor and says, I was only joking, trying to hide evil, reckless, hateful behavior under the guise of some sort of a joke. Didn't really mean it. I wasn't serious. I don't suppose if you got shot or I got shot by a flaming arrow in the middle of the chest by some maniac, he said, I didn't mean to hit you. That wouldn't make it feel any better, would it? There's a point of wisdom to be made here. We got to be careful about our tongue because in many ways it's like an arrow. It can have that kind of impact. And it does no good for us to try to excuse or to pass off our reckless behavior under the guise of suggesting that it wasn't really intended to be hurtful. Doesn't matter, it was. Mr. Aitken writes, this person who is condemned in this passage, this foolish behavior, recklessly throws around words like flaming arrows, and when his neighbor is pierced, he thinks that his lame, I'm only joking, excuses him. He's graduated from teasing and ragging to downright mischief making, and he can't tell the difference. Well, we've crossed the line, all right. It's one thing to tease in a good-natured way, but there's teasing that's not funny, that crosses the line into slander or deception with an evil motive and an evil effect. In the pulpit commentary, we find this note: the injury is not less real because he excuses it by alleging that it was done not seriously but playfully. No more than the fatal effects of the murderous weapons are lessened by being employed at the hands of a maniac. Mr. Bridges says, what are sometimes called practical jokes come under this awful charge. And we might think about that. We don't watch a lot of television, don't have network television. But I think there are things that are put forward on the internet and such places as entertainment that really are cruel. Cruelty masquerading as humor. And some of that may be involved in this picture the wise man brings to us. Mr. Garrett sees a rather dark picture when he sees the passage as referring to a person who enjoys gossiping about or tampering with the affairs of other people. And then he'll purposefully confuse and engage in other kinds of social disinformation. And when called into account, he or she will treat the whole thing as a game and at least pretend to be oblivious to all the hurt such actions have created. Just joking, just kidding. Well, there's kidding and joking, and then there's slander and mischief and misinformation and abuse And none of that is excused by the lame idea that, well, it was all a joke, any more than the effects of the maniac with the arrows are excused because, well, he wasn't really trying to hurt us. The effect is there. Let's look at another, if we may. This time in the 26th chapter, verse 20. And look at a couple of 3 verses here that I think are linked together with a common thought. In verse 20, we read, "Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. So where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. As coals are to burning coals, and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. They go down into the innermost parts of the belly." I think there are 2 or 3 lessons that the wise man is teaching us here, but they're connected together with these words. The word talebearer shows up a couple of times. And a similar idea, a similar thought is this word for a contentious man. The word talebearer is used only 4 times in the Old Testament, all of them in Proverbs. And it goes back to the idea of a gossiper, a slanderer, somebody who harms someone else verbally, falsely, spread false stories about someone, and particularly those who tend to whisper things. They say them publicly, but not in the presence or not in the hearing of the one whom they're talking about. And so in a secret way, they go about spreading poison from ear to ear. So he has something to say about the talebearer. We know who that is. Somebody who carries the tale from house to house, some dirt on somebody that is told without any good purpose in mind. You know, again, we'll say, there's a time when you've got to go to somebody and say, hey, here's the problem. There might be a time, the Apostle Paul said when he wrote to the church at Corinth, a very troubled church, in the first chapter, he said, "It's reported to me by them of the house of Chloe, you got problems. There are contentions among you." Paul deals with that. I don't think the house of Chloe, whoever they were gossiping about the church. They were concerned about it. They knew the apostle needed to know about that, and he wrote them about those problems without any blame for those brethren. But we have, on the other hand, people who pass along ill news for sport. And that fits the talebearer. The contentious man is just a man with a bad attitude, a fiery attitude. You can see the connection there. His relationship to strife is the same as a man who, or rather is the same as wood is to a fire. You just need contentious people to have a row. And this is the guy that's got that kind of attitude. A quarreler, a pugilist, a fighter, an embittered, angry individual. The old saying about somebody who will fight at the drop of a hat, he'll drop the hat. You've heard that kind of description of some people. So it is. They're easily stirred up, and their anger tends to stir other people up in a way that's not godly. And you got that in the church. It's shameful, but it's true. I remember several years ago, a wise old brother made this point. He said, you know, some people say that the particular subject that he was going to talk about that night, Bible subject, he said, some people say that this subject is a touchy subject. He said, after years of trying to teach the Bible, I've decided there are no touchy Bible subjects. He said, now there are some touchy brethren, and there are enough of them, but no touchy Bible subjects. I think he was exactly right. You know, there are challenges, there are problems, there's truth that might cut deep, but contentiousness is a different thing. It doesn't have to be connected with any of those other things. It's an attitude of heart that's bitter and unkind and unloving. And he has something to say about that. He talks about the contentious man as the guy that keeps it going. Let's think about 3 lessons that the wise man teaches here about tale-bearing and contentiousness. In the first place, it takes the contentious man to start strife. Kindle strife is the old King James language. Some of the modern speech translations say inflame. But that's a pretty good idea. You know, I haven't had many fireplaces where I've lived through the years, but I've seen enough fires started to know something about the process. And you put that kindling in and get that spark in there in order to get it going, and then you can put the big logs on, and that's where the fire begins. And he said contentious people have a way of building things up and making sure that that flame gets high. Mr. Alden again writes, even today we connect the same ideas of fire and burning to anger and angry people. Consider a, quote, heated argument between people who are, quote, hot under the collar or who have fiery tempers. That's right. Nothing new about that. And so the wise man says, I tell you, if you have hot people, you're going to have trouble. And so hot heads are a problem. There's some people just have a talent for setting fires or fanning them into significance. Anger provoking anger. Bitterness provoking bitterness. In the 16th chapter in verse 28, we notice this passage. This is from the paraphrase. Gossip is spread by wicked people. They stir up trouble and break up friendships. Some people have a way in their behavior of making people angry at one another, dividing even close friends. So the wise man says, understand how hateful that is. And if you like that, you need to quit now. And if you know folks like that, you need to see them as the trouble that they are. And until they change, you can't deal with people like that. Talebearer is going to keep strife going. Not only will a contentious man begin the trouble, but there are people who just have a way of, with their hateful tongue, just keeping trouble going and going and going. In the Bible in basic English, it's rendered this way. Without wood, a fire goes out. Where there is no secret talk, an argument is ended. And that's right. So here's the fuel that keeps the fire going. I like again what Matthew Henry wrote about this many years ago. He said, we must not give ear to talebearers, for they feed the fire of contention with fuel. You know, there are words that are just like gasoline on a fire. That's what he's saying. They're combustible matter. Tales that are fireballs. And those who by insinuating base characters, revealing secrets, things that have no reason to be told, misrepresenting words and actions. You know, there's some folks who can tell something that may be factually true, but is so out of context it gives the wrong idea. They take statements out of context. I'm sure you probably heard this before from me or somebody else. One of the illustrations from many years ago, there was on a ship, a captain and his first officer, and as the story goes, every day they would make a log, and that would include the behavior of the sailors and the officers. And so on this particular day, the captain was keeping the log. They took turns among the officers. And on this particular day, the first mate wound up getting drunk. Well, he shouldn't have done that, but he did. And so he was still a bit drunk when he came on duty. And so the captain wrote him up, as we say. He said, first mate drunk. And the fellow complained, that's just not fair. This is not typical of my behavior. He said, it's true. So not too long after that, the first mate had a chance to keep the log. And his first entry in that was Captain Sober today. Well, that was true. Of course, the captain was sober every day. But the implication of that is it was something special. The point is you can tell something true, but you can couch it in such a way that it really is misleading. That's the kind of thing we see here. Anyway, let me get back to Mr. Henry's point. Misrepresenting words and actions. Do what they can to make relations, friends, neighbors jealous of one another. Alienate them one from another. Sow discord among them. They are to be banished out of families, out of society. And then strife will as surely cease as a fire go out when it has no fuel. Does that seem extreme to you? That you just cut people off? That you just cut off association with somebody? Because they're gossips and they're slanders and they have that evil kind of heart and they just wind up tearing up and destroying. I'll say this, when it comes to the church, I believe that's exactly a part of the New Testament instruction. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul made it very plain that local churches and the fellowship of a local church are to be under the discipline of God. And he talks about, in this particular context, here's a man who was involved in gross immorality. And the church needed to mark that man, have no company with him, to try to make him ashamed. It wasn't they hated him. But in verse 11, when he talks about more broadly, he says, I've written to you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, or covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such a one, know not to eat. That word railers, that's not a word we use anymore. I think the New International Version renders that word slanderer. That'd be very close to what we're talking about here. And if you have in the church someone who has been found to be a person spreading gossip, spreading rumors, doing what they can for whatever their motives are. Maybe they tell you it was all in fun. Pretty evil fun, like the other verse said. But anyway, whatever their motives are, if they won't straighten that out, they ought to be marked and they ought to be put out of the number. That's how serious it is. Another lesson, though, that we learn from this, not only does the contentious start strife and the talebearer keeps it going, but he says in verse 21 that the words of a talebearer have a powerful impact. The old King James again reads, that should be verse 22, I'm sorry. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. They go down to the innermost part of the belly. That's the old King James. And so the words of the talebearer are as wounds. The King James uses that word wounds, and Matthew Henry in picking up on that thought and that imagery writes this, that the words of a talebearer are as wounds, deep and dangerous wounds, wounds in the vitals. They wound the reputation of him who is belied, and perhaps the wound proves incurable even if the plaster of recantation, which seldom can be obtained, may not prove wide enough for it. The point he's making is, that harsh, unkind, slanderous words can sometimes leave a deep scar and a painful impact, even if the person who makes the charges later on recants and says, well, that wasn't true. Isn't that so? Don't we all know that to be true? It's a tragedy. But all you have to do to ruin a man is accuse him. You don't have to prove it. But just accusing people of some terrible, dreadful crime can ruin them. That makes front page news. And after all the turmoil and back and forth and arguments, the lawyers are paid on page 54 of the paper. Back when we used to have a paper. Then you say, oh, well, it was thrown out of court. That doesn't make front page news. You can't go and reach everybody. If you could, some people are still not going to believe the good. They're going to believe the bad. It's devilish. And so he says that's in part what the wise man is talking about here. They wound the love and the charity which he to whom they are spoken ought to have for his neighbor, and give a fatal stab to the friendship and Christian fellowship. He said, we must therefore not be talebearers ourselves at any time, nor ever do any ill offices, but we should not give the least countenance to those who are. tell the gossip to be quiet, or grab them by the arm gently and kindly and say, let's go see the person that you're running down here to meet. And let's just all get together in a room and see if we can work this out. Don't tell me about them. Let's go talk to them about it. And so the wounds of the talebearer. But you may notice, if you have another translation or are following along with us, that there are some different translations of that particular word. A number of the modern speech translations, I think just about all the other translations, in fact, see this word coming from a root verb meaning, as Brandriver and Briggs defines it, to gulp, to swallow greedily, to be gulped. Gulp something down. And so, with that idea in mind, the picture shifts a little bit. I think it's another true story, though it's a little different story. The ESV reads, the words of the whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the innermost part of the body. The words of a gossip are swallowed greedily, and they go down into the person's innermost being. If that's the better translation, then maybe the dominant lesson of the passage is in part how terrible and yet how common the human trait is that we love to tell and to hear some bad news about other people. It's hard to deny that that's a fact. If you look at a list of the most popular websites, you won't have to go too far down the list before you'll find some gossip site. Again, before the internet, when there were papers, the National Enquirer sold a lot of papers. People like to read some dirt about somebody, some outrageous story about somebody famous, something that tears somebody else down. There's just something that is rather tasty about that kind of news. And it suggests something bad about me when I have that kind of attitude. Really, it's a flaw. It's a flaw in me. When I sort of enjoy somebody else's turmoil or trouble or problems, if that's how I need to feel better about myself, by seeing somebody else torn down, or finding somebody else that has done something bad, whether real or imagined, then that is a shame. And so the words of the whisperer are just delicious to some people, because that's what they like. Shame on us when that's the case. But that idea of it going down to the deepest part, into the viscera of a person, that also says something too. It goes back to what we said a moment ago. I tell you, those words can be long-lasting. The effects can be long-lasting. It's amazing how a story told, an unflattering story, even if it's not true, years later, people remember that, and when they see that person, they'll think about that story, that dirt that was told on them so many years ago. It goes down to the very bottom. It has a deep effect. So what's the point? The point is, be careful about the words you speak, because they do matter. It does count. And sometimes we can do damage that even later we come to regret we can't undo. And none of us would enjoy being the victim of such behavior. Don't do those things. And by all means, do not countenance those who do. Let them know immediately, I don't want to hear that. And if I think there's some good to come out of this, then let's go together and talk to this person and see if we can get something corrected. But just to tell dirt is ungodly. It's foolish. It's devilish, really. We all remember that the word diabolos, devil, is literally translated slander, slanderer. Okay, well, our time is close here, but we'll try to see if we can get through one more. In verse 23, we have again a few, I think, thoughts that are connected together here. The burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. He that hateth dissembleth with his lips, and lays up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be shown before the whole congregation. Here we have again more sins of the tongue. In verse 23, we're reminded of something, and that is that there is sometimes a great difference between what people say and what they really think in their heart, where they really are. When the King James uses that expression, burning lips, I don't think it's anything romantic about that. I think the idea may be best understood as though the idea of words that are hot with emotion and flattery, words that are intended to express deep affection, but that's not really how they feel. In fact, how they feel in their heart is something entirely different. And he says that's like taking a clay pot and putting on the outside of it a thin veneer of silver. You take the dross of silver, after you purify the silver, and just take the less worthy stuff and just make that an outer coating for really a clay pot. Some have suggested the idea might be glazing, taking some glazing material. But the idea is the same. That is, on the outside it looks like one thing, but really it's not near as valuable as it seems. There's a difference there. Pretensions of friendship, where real malice is harbored, is utterly worthless. And that's right. And there's a lot of that goes on in the world. You can't always take people at their word. We want to, and we try to, but we must not be naive enough to miss the signs, as it were, because that would be a tragedy. Okay, I think what I'll do is stop there at verse 23, and I'll see if I can run through these other points and make a couple of applications next time, because I do think these are important warnings. We'll try then to get in, Lord willing, next Tuesday to chapter 27 if you'd like to read ahead. I do appreciate those who take time to study with us in this way. It's helpful for me, and I hope it's useful to you also. So we hope you have a good week. We hope to see you back here next Tuesday. Thanks again for taking the time. Take care.